The gathering storm. The afternoon sun hung low over Westgate Park, casting long golden rays through the towering oaks that lined the edges of the neighborhood. The scent of grilled meat mixed with the sweetness of freshly cut watermelon, filling the air with the unmistakable aroma of summer. Laughter echoed from every corner, kids darting between picnic tables, music spilling from an old radio, and the gentle murmur of conversations weaving into the warm breeze. This was supposed to be a day of celebration, a community barbecue, where families gathered, where neighbors exchanged stories, where people felt safe. And yet, something in the air felt off. An unease that couldn't quite be explained. Some of the adults, especially the older ones who had lived through too many moments like this, exchanged wary glances. A few parents subtly guided their children closer, their instincts whispering that the joy of the moment might not last. At the center of it all sat Jaden Carter, a 15-year-old boy with crutches resting at his side. His right leg was wrapped in a bulky cast, a sharp contrast to the vibrant summer setting. But despite the injury, his laughter rang the loudest. "Man, you should have seen your face when that ball came flying at you," his friend Malik teased, nudging Jaden's shoulder. Jaden grinned, shaking his head. "You're just mad because I still made the shot, even with one leg." Their small circle of friends erupted into laughter. They knew Jaden. He was always like this, unstoppable, even when life tried to slow him down. Across the field, a tall man with a salt and pepper beard stood watching. His presence alone carried a quiet power, a gravity that even strangers respected. Christopher Carter was not a man to be ignored. He scanned the park, his gaze sharp and calculated. His instincts, honed over years of battling injustice in courtrooms, whispered to him that something was off. Then, a shadow passed over him, a presence he felt before he even saw. At the edge of the gathering, stepping out of a patrol car with slow, deliberate movements, was Officer Raymond Dalton, the weight of a badge. The moment Dalton's black boots hit the pavement, the atmosphere in the park shifted. The casual laughter softened. Conversations faltered. People straightened their backs, their shoulders tensing like they were bracing for a storm. He wasn't just any cop. He was their cop, the one assigned to keep order in this neighborhood. The one who never smiled, never greeted, only loomed. A man who seemed to believe that the people here did not deserve peace. Dalton's presence alone was enough to remind them. No matter how safe they felt in this moment, they were being watched. And today, Dalton had found his target. His cold, calculating eyes landed on Jaden Carter, a teenager, a boy with crutches, someone he had already decided was beneath him. Dalton's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smirk, but it held the same malice. And then he walked forward. A predator's approach. Jaden didn't notice at first. He was still laughing, still immersed in the warmth of the moment. But then, the conversations around him died. The music from the radio was still playing, but it suddenly felt far away. Jaden's instinct told him to look up, and when he did, he saw Dalton. The man moved with the same arrogance as always, hands on his belt, his patrol uniform neatly pressed, as if he had stepped out of a military lineup. His sunglasses reflected the sky, hiding whatever ugly thoughts lurked behind them. Dalton didn't need a reason to stop in front of Jaden. He just wanted to. "Hey, kid." Dalton's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "What do you think you're doing?" Jaden blinked, caught off guard. Sitting." Dalton's jaw tightened, his fingers twitching near his baton. "Sitting, huh?" He took a step closer, his shadow stretching over Jaden's chair, like some king lounging while everyone else works. Jaden frowned, his fingers gripping the armrests of his chair. He hadn't done anything wrong, so why was this guy acting like he had? Dalton leaned down slightly, his voice dropping just low enough for only Jaden to hear. "You faking it?" Jaden's chest tightened. "What?" Dalton's lips curled in disgust. "Your leg. I've seen kids like you before. always looking for a reason to slack off. Maybe you just like having people feel sorry for you." Jaden's fingers clenched into fists, but he didn't look away. "It's broken," Jaden said, his voice even. Dalton scoffed. "Yeah, sure. Convenient." Around them, people had stopped moving. They were watching, waiting. Jaden's father had noticed too. Christopher Carter took a step forward, but he didn't speak. Not yet. He knew this game, knew exactly how men like Dalton operated. Dalton wanted Jaden to react, wanted to provoke him. And Jaden, being just a kid, might not realize the trap being set. Dalton's eyes flickered down to the crutches resting beside the chair. And then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he lifted his boot and kicked them aside. They clattered against the pavement. Jaden froze. The crowd gasped. Dalton took a step back, tilting his head. Oops. Jaden's heart pounded. For a second, he forgot how to breathe. Not the crutches. They were his legs, his way of moving, his way of standing. And this man, this stranger in uniform, had just ripped that from him. Dalton smirked. "Guess you'll have to get up on your own now." Jaden stared at him. His body wanted to tremble. His mind told him to stay quiet. But his soul, his father's fire, wouldn't let him. He gritted his teeth, his hands shaking as he tried to push himself up. Dalton stepped back, his smirk widening. "Oh, gonna prove me wrong," he laughed. "Go ahead. Stand up." Jaden tried. Pain shot through his leg the second he put weight on it. His arms trembled, his casted foot barely brushing the ground before the agony became too much. His body gave out, and he collapsed. The silence that followed was deafening. Dalton sighed, shaking his head as if he were disappointed. "See, that's the problem with kids like you. Always relying on someone else to hold you up." Jaden clenched his jaw, fighting the burning behind his eyes. Not here. Not in front of him. Dalton turned to the watching crowd, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "This is what happens when you make excuses," he said. "Weakness." The weight of his words crushed the air. Jaden's father moved. Fast. Before anyone could react, Christopher Carter was standing directly in front of Dalton. Dalton's smirk vanished. Christopher's voice was low, steady, and lethal. "Pick up my son's crutches," he said. "Right now." Dalton's hand drifted toward his baton. Christopher didn't flinch. And in that moment, Dalton realized something. He had made a very big mistake. A father's fury, a community's fire. The air between Christopher Carter and Officer Dalton thickened into something almost tangible. It was no longer just heat from the summer sun pressing against them. It was power, a silent battle of wills, one that every person in the park could feel. Dalton's smirk was gone. Christopher stood his ground, his broad shoulders squared, his gaze unwavering. He was not a man who spoke carelessly. Every word he uttered carried weight, and right now his words were made of iron. "Pick up my son's crutches." Christopher's voice was so low it was almost a growl. Dalton's jaw tightened, his hand twitched near his baton, a habit formed from years of intimidation, years of having the upper hand. But for the first time in a long time, he wasn't in control. The crowd watched silently, their breath held, their hands tightening into fists. The tension wasn't just thick. It was alive, buzzing like a storm about to break open. Jaden, still on the ground, fought to steady his breathing. His mother was beside him, her arms around his shoulders, whispering reassurances. But Jaden could barely hear her. His ears were filled with his own heartbeat, his mind locked onto one painful thought. He humiliated me, in front of everyone. Dalton's gaze flickered between Christopher and the growing number of people recording him. The realization was slow but inescapable. He wasn't just facing an angry father. He was facing the community. And they weren't backing down. The moment that changed everything. Dalton's lips curled, his pride still clinging to him like a lifeline. You think you can order me around?" He sneered, taking a step forward. "You think this is your courtroom, counselor?" Christopher didn't blink. "I think you're standing in front of an entire neighborhood witnessing your abuse of power," he said, his voice calm, but piercing. "And I think you know exactly what's about to happen next." Dalton's grip on his baton tightened. His boots shifted slightly. Jaden saw it before it even happened. He barely had time to suck in a breath before Dalton moved. The swing that didn't land. Dalton's baton came up. Fast. But Christopher was faster. Before anyone could register what had happened, Christopher's hand shot out. With the precision of a man who had been in many fights before, he caught Dalton's wrist in midair. The impact sent a ripple through the crowd. Gasps, shouts, someone screamed. Dalton's eyes widened in shock. He had expected Christopher to flinch, maybe stumble back, maybe even submit. But Christopher Carter was not that kind of man. His grip tightened. Dalton's wrist cracked under the pressure. Christopher's voice was low, controlled, and dangerous. "You just made your last mistake." Dalton yanked back in fury, but Christopher didn't let go. His grip was iron, his stare merciless. And then he twisted. Dalton yelped, a sound nobody had ever heard from him before. The baton clattered to the ground, bouncing once before settling right next to Jaden's fallen crutches. The symbolism was not lost on anyone. A hush fell over the crowd. This was it. The moment the balance shifted. Dalton stumbled backward, his face pale, his authority shattered. For the first time, he wasn't the one holding power. And he knew it. The reckoning begins. Christopher bent down, his movements slow, deliberate. He picked up Jaden's crutches, and then he picked up Dalton's fallen baton. He held them both in front of him, turning them over in his hands. The crowd watched, their eyes locked onto the contrast between the two objects. One was a tool of support. The other was a tool of oppression. Christopher's gaze met Dalton's. "You want to teach my son a lesson," he said, his voice quiet but boiling with restrained rage. "Then here's one for you." He threw the baton at Dalton's feet. Then he turned, knelt beside Jaden, and gently handed him his crutches back. "You stand when you're ready, son," Christopher said. "Not when some coward tries to force you to." Jaden's hands shook as he took them. He could barely breathe. His father's strength was wrapping around him, holding him together when he felt like he was falling apart. He wanted to say thank you, but his throat was too tight. His father wasn't finished yet. He stood up again, his full height towering over Dalton, over the entire situation. "I will be filing formal charges," Christopher said, his voice loud enough for the crowd to hear. "Police brutality, abuse of power, endangering a minor, unlawful intimidation. And that's just the beginning." Dalton snarled, his face twisted in humiliation. "You think you can ruin me?" Christopher smirked. "No," he said. "You did that to yourself." The community rises. What happened next was something that would be remembered for years. The people in the crowd moved. Not with fear, not with hesitation, but with purpose. People, neighbors, friends, strangers, stepped forward. Phones were raised higher. People spoke up. "This isn't the first time," someone said. "I saw him do this last year," another voice added. "He stopped my brother for no reason last month." This is over. Dalton's confidence crumbled. It wasn't just one man standing against him now. It was everyone. He stumbled back, his hands shaking, his breathing rapid. He saw it now. His authority was gone. The moment he had touched Jaden's crutches, the moment he had tried to break a child in front of an entire community, he had lost. Justice arrives. Sirens. Blue and red flashing lights. 2 police cruisers pulled up at the edge of the park. But they weren't here for Christopher. They were here for Dalton. 2 officers stepped out, their expressions serious. Internal affairs. Dalton's face drained of color. "This is a mistake," he started. "I was just doing my job." One of the officers, a woman with sharp eyes, held up a hand. "We've already seen the footage," she said. Dalton froze. "You're being placed on immediate suspension pending investigation," the officer continued. "Hand over your badge and your weapon." Dalton staggered. He turned toward Christopher, hatred burning in his eyes. But Christopher just stared back, unshaken, unmoved. And then, Dalton's badge came off. The moment it left his chest, the community erupted. Not just in cheers, not just in relief, but in solidarity. Because they knew this wasn't just about today. This was about all the days before, and all the days that would come after. Jaden, still gripping his crutches, watched it all unfold. And for the first time since he had fallen to the ground, he felt something return to him. Dignity, strength, hope, the fire that wouldn't die. The echoes of the cheers had barely faded when the reality of what had just happened began to settle in. Jaden Carter, still gripping his crutches with trembling hands, watched as Officer Dalton was led away, his badge surrendered, his authority stripped in front of an entire neighborhood that had suffered under his presence for years. Jaden should have felt relieved. He should have felt victorious. But instead, he felt exposed. The world around him was still buzzing, people taking videos, shouting their opinions, rushing to share what they had just witnessed. Jaden wasn't used to this kind of attention. He had spent most of his life trying to blend in, to be just another face in the crowd. But now he was front and center, the kid whose crutches had been taken, the one who had been humiliated in front of everyone. And despite everything his father had done, despite the justice unfolding in real time, he still heard Dalton's words echoing in his head. "People like you." He swallowed hard, gripping his crutches tighter. He had never felt so exposed. The cameras turned inward. "Jaden, can we get a statement?" A voice pierced through the noise. Jaden blinked, realizing that reporters had started arriving. Some had microphones. Others held cameras. Their faces were filled with urgency, hunger, not for food, but for a story. For his story. A young woman in a navy blue blazer stepped forward, her cameraman close behind. "Jaden, you just experienced police brutality firsthand. What would you like to say about what happened today?" Jaden's throat closed. What was he supposed to say? That he felt small, that he felt weak, that despite everything, part of him still felt like the same scared kid sitting in a chair when the world turned against him. He hesitated. Then, a strong hand rested on his shoulder. His father. Christopher Carter didn't say a word. He just squeezed Jaden's shoulder, grounding him, reminding him that he was not alone. Jaden inhaled deeply, then faced the reporter. He exhaled, his voice shaking but steadying. "I just wanted to sit with my friends. I just wanted to enjoy the barbecue." His words weren't loud, but they were heard. And that was enough. The fire spreads beyond the park. Within an hour, footage of the confrontation had gone viral. People on social media were exploding with outrage. The hashtag started trending almost instantly. Hashtag Justice for Jaden. Hashtag Take Their Badges. Hashtag End Police Abuse. The video spread far beyond the neighborhood, far beyond the small barbecue that had started as just another gathering. Now, it was being played on news networks. People from across the country, from different cities and backgrounds, were watching, commenting, sharing. And just like that, Jaden had gone from being a victim to a symbol. Dalton's last stand. Inside the police station, Officer Dalton sat with his arms crossed, his face stone cold, but his heart was pounding. He wasn't stupid. He knew that this was bad. Suspension was one thing. Public outrage was another. But this was the kind of thing that ruined careers. His lawyer, a man in his late 40s with graying hair and tired eyes, sighed as he scrolled through his phone. "They're already talking about bringing in the Department of Justice for an independent investigation," he muttered. Dalton clenched his jaw. Over one kid. His lawyer slowly looked up. That one kid has the entire nation watching now. His father is a top civil rights attorney. They're talking about pressing federal charges. Dalton froze. Federal. Not just internal police discipline. Not just a slap on the wrist. They wanted to bury him. His mind raced, grasping for something. Anything. To turn this around. Then he smirked. He knew what to do. If they want to play dirty, he murmured, I'll play dirtier. The lies begin. By morning, the backlash had started. Not against Dalton. Against Jaden. An anonymous leak started spreading online. Old photos, misleading captions, fabricated accusations. Claims that Jaden had faked his injury. Claims that Jaden had been in trouble before. Claims that Jaden's father was manipulating the system to push an agenda. It was a disgusting, desperate move. But it worked. The internet, as always, divided. People who had never met Jaden were suddenly arguing about him, debating his humanity as if it were a matter of opinion. Some defended him, furious at the transparent smear campaign. Others, those who needed an excuse to ignore the truth, latched onto the lies like leeches. And just like that, Jaden's battle got even harder. A family under siege. Jaden sat in his living room, his phone buzzing nonstop. The notifications didn't stop. Hate messages, death threats, support messages, more threats. His mother looked at him, eyes filled with worry. "This is getting out of control," she said softly. Christopher Carter stood by the window, staring at the flashing headlights of news vans parked outside their home. "It was never in control," he muttered. Jaden's head ached. His chest was tight. He never asked for this. He never wanted to be famous. He just wanted to go to a barbecue. "I don't want to do this anymore," Jaden finally said, his voice strained. "I just wanted to stop." Christopher turned to him, and for the first time since the incident, his father's expression softened. "I know, son," he said gently, "but if we stop now..." He exhaled. "Then they win." Jaden looked at him, eyes burning. "I don't care about winning," he whispered. "I just want to feel normal again." Christopher kneeled in front of him, placing both hands on Jaden's shoulders. "Normal is what they want you to chase," his father said. "They want you to give up, to let this fade away. Because if you do, then nothing changes." Jaden swallowed hard. "They want me to be quiet." Christopher nodded. "Yes, but you know what, son?" Jaden wiped his eyes. "What?" Christopher smiled, a small, tired smile, but one filled with steel. "You don't have to be. The fight isn't over." The next morning, Jaden's face was everywhere. News interviews, talk shows, social media. His family's lawyers were ready. Protests were growing. Politicians were speaking out. The pressure on the police department, on the city, on the justice system, was rising. And for the first time, Jaden understood. This wasn't about a barbecue anymore. This wasn't even about him. This was about all the kids like him, the ones who had been silenced, ignored, disrespected, and beaten down. And he had a choice. He could let them erase him, or he could make sure they never forgot his name. Jaden took a deep breath. And when the next reporter put a microphone in front of him, he spoke. The war for truth. The days following the incident at the barbecue were a blur of noise, flashing lights and voices, some full of support, others dripping with hatred. Jaden Carter had become more than just a kid with crutches. He was now a movement. But movements came with consequences. The smear campaign against him had taken root, spreading like wildfire across social media and cable news. Fabricated reports about his troubled past appeared overnight, feeding into the narrative that he deserved what happened to him. Why was he even at a barbecue if he was so injured? Was this just another race-baiting stunt? His father's a lawyer. This is all for money. Everywhere Jaden turned, his name was being dragged into debates he never asked to be a part of. And it was exhausting. His phone buzzed with messages, some kind, others cruel. Strangers sent him death threats. People he had never met before suddenly had opinions about his life. His mother cried at night, thinking no one could hear her. His father never let his guard down. And Jaden felt trapped. Not just in his house, surrounded by reporters. Not just in his head, where Dalton's cruel voice still echoed. But trapped between who he was before and who the world now expected him to be. And the worst part, he didn't know if he was strong enough to fight this battle. The first attack. 2 days after the video went viral, Jaden's family received their first real threat. Not an online comment, not a tweet, a brick through their window. Jaden had been sitting in the living room when it happened, staring blankly at the TV, where a news panel was debating whether or not Dalton had been too harsh, but within his rights. Then, crash. Glass shattered. The impact was like a bomb exploding inside their home. Jaden's mother screamed, shielding herself as shards of glass rained across the floor. His father rushed in from the kitchen, a gun already in his hand, his instincts honed by years of defending others. Jaden's heart pounded. He couldn't breathe. And then he saw the note attached to the brick. Dropped these charges, or else. For a long moment, no one moved. Jaden's mother shook, gripping her chest. His father slowly walked to the brick, picked it up, and turned it over in his hands. Jaden watched as his father's face, normally calm, even in moments of high tension, hardened into something else. Something deadly. "We're not stopping," Christopher Carter murmured. Jaden saw it then. The fire in his father's eyes. A fire that no amount of threats or violence could put out. And for the first time in days, Jaden felt something new. Rage. Dalton's defense. A monster fights back. Officer Dalton was not going down quietly. The moment he had been put on suspension, he had already begun plotting his comeback. He had connections. He had friends in the department. And most of all, he had enough arrogance to believe that he was untouchable. Inside his lawyer's office, Dalton sat across from his defense team, his face red with frustration. "This is a damn joke," he spat, slamming his hand against the table. "I did my job. I kept order." His lawyer, a sleek-looking man in a $1,000 suit, sighed. "You didn't just keep order, Ray. You're on video assaulting a minor. You took away a crippled kid's crutches." Dalton clenched his jaw. "He's not crippled." The lawyer raised an eyebrow. "He's got a broken leg, Ray." Dalton scoffed, leaning back in his chair. "That kid's just another punk who thinks the world owes him something." The lawyer steepled his fingers. "It doesn't matter what you think. What matters is how we fight back." He slid a folder across the table. Dalton opened it and smirked. Inside were fabricated reports, doctored images, false witness statements, everything he needed to make Jaden Carter look like a liar. "This," the lawyer continued, "is how we turn this around." Dalton grinned, and the real war began. The lawsuit that shook the nation. Jaden Carter's family filed a lawsuit. It wasn't just a simple case of police brutality. This was about systemic abuse, about holding an entire department accountable. And as soon as they announced their legal action, the city exploded. Protests, press conferences, public debates. Dalton's supporters rallied behind him, calling the lawsuit a witch hunt, an attack on law enforcement. But the opposite happened too. Thousands marched for Jaden. Thousands demanded justice. And suddenly, this wasn't just about one boy anymore. This was about every black teenager who had ever been profiled, every disabled person who had ever been dismissed, every family who had been silenced by a broken system. Jaden Carter had become the face of something bigger than himself. And it was terrifying. The night that changed everything. A week before the trial, Jaden couldn't sleep. He tossed, turned. His mind was restless. And then, he heard something, a noise outside. His pulse spiked. He grabbed his crutches, moving toward the window. When he looked outside, his stomach dropped. There was a figure standing across the street, just outside the glow of the street lamp. Watching. Waiting. Jaden's breath hitched. The figure didn't move. Didn't speak. Then, the headlights of a car turned on, flashing in his direction. And in that brief moment, Jaden saw his face. Dalton. Jaden's blood ran cold. Dalton smirked, then got into the car and drove away. Jaden stood frozen in place, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of his chest. He knew what this was. A message. Dalton wasn't just fighting in court. He was stalking him. And for the first time since this whole thing began, Jaden asked himself the one question he never wanted to think about. What if this doesn't end in a courtroom? The choice that would define him. By sunrise, Jaden had made his decision. If Dalton thought he could scare him, if he thought he could make him disappear, if he thought he could turn this into another forgotten case, he was wrong. Because Jaden Carter wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. And the next time someone put a microphone in front of him, Jaden didn't hesitate. I'm not going anywhere. And neither was the fight for justice. The battle in the courtroom. The day had finally arrived. Jaden Carter sat in the back of a cold, sterile courtroom, his hands clenched together as the trial of Raymond Dalton began. For weeks, he had been the center of chaos, a 15-year-old boy caught in a storm he never asked for. But today, this wasn't just about him. It was about every person who had been humiliated, every family who had been torn apart by a system that refused to see them as equals. Dalton had stolen more than Jaden's crutches that day. He had stolen a piece of Jaden's dignity. And today, in front of the entire nation, Jaden was going to get it back. The faces in the crowd. The courtroom was packed. The press, the protesters, the activists, the opportunists. Jaden scanned the room, seeing faces he recognized. His mother, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned white. His father, his jaw tight, his shoulders squared like a soldier ready to go to war. And then, there were the ones who had come to tear him down. A row of uniformed officers, all there in support of Dalton. People who saw Jaden as the enemy. A kid who made a cop's life hell, instead of a child who had been brutalized for simply existing. And at the front, sitting stiffly beside his defense attorney, was Raymond Dalton himself. Jaden's stomach twisted. Dalton looked unbothered, like this was just another day. Like the past few months hadn't turned his name into a symbol of racist violence. Jaden hated that. He wanted to see Dalton squirm. He wanted him to feel what he had felt, that powerlessness, that humiliation. But Dalton just sat there, hands folded, looking annoyed that he even had to be here. And then the judge walked in. It was time. The charges read aloud. The courtroom fell silent as the prosecutor, a woman in her early 40s with sharp eyes and a voice that carried authority, stood. Your Honor, we present the following charges against Officer Raymond Dalton. Her voice was unshakable. 1 count of assault against a minor. 1 count of misuse of authority. 1 count of reckless endangerment. 1 count of official misconduct. Jaden's pulse pounded in his ears. Every charge felt like a stone being placed on Dalton's shoulders. And yet, Dalton barely reacted. But the jury did. 12 strangers, sitting in the jury box, their eyes flicking toward Jaden. Some with sympathy. Some with doubt. And at least one, a middle-aged white man in a suit, with obvious skepticism. Jaden could feel it. He knew this wasn't going to be easy. Dalton's defense. Lies and manipulation. Dalton's lawyer stood next. A tall, lean man in an expensive suit, his expression calculated. He walked toward the jury with deliberate slowness, as if he were letting the weight of the accusations sink in. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, he began, his voice smooth. We're here today because of one moment. A moment where an officer was simply doing his job, and a young man saw an opportunity. Jaden's fingernails dug into his palms. Let's be clear, the lawyer continued. This is not about race. This is not about oppression. This is about an officer who was falsely accused by a teenager looking for a way to gain attention. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Jaden's jaw tightened. "You'll see," the lawyer went on, turning slightly toward the jury, "that this case is built on emotions, not facts." He gestured toward Jaden, a boy who claimed to be injured, but we have footage of him walking just fine days later. Jaden's breath caught. He knew exactly what footage they were talking about. A clip from a week ago, him walking up a few stairs, using only one crutch. It had been a good day. A rare moment where his leg wasn't throbbing, where he had pushed himself. And now, they were twisting it into proof that he was faking everything. Jaden's father's hand grazed his shoulder, a quiet reminder to stay calm. Jaden clenched his jaw. He had come too far to fall apart now. Jaden takes the stand. When it was his turn, Jaden forced himself to stand tall. All eyes were on him. He could hear the cameras clicking. The courtroom felt smaller than it was, like the walls were closing in. The prosecutor approached. "Jaden," she said gently, "can you tell the jury what happened on the day of the incident?" Jaden licked his lips, nodded. "I was at a barbecue with my friends," he said. His voice was strong, even though his hands trembled slightly. "We were just talking, laughing, and then he walked up to me." His eyes flicked toward Dalton. The man stared back, unblinking. Jaden forced himself to look away. "He started questioning me, asking if I was faking my injury," Jaden continued. "Then he kicked my crutches away." A sharp murmur ran through the courtroom. Jaden clenched his hands in his lap. "And then," the prosecutor pressed. Jaden swallowed. "I tried to stand," he said, "and I couldn't." His voice shook at the memory. For a split second, he was back there, on the ground, staring up at Dalton's cold smirk. Jaden squeezed his eyes shut. He wouldn't let this man win again. The prosecutor nodded. "And what did he say to you?" Jaden's fists clenched. "He told me people like me always look for something to lean on." The jury stiffened. Some of them looked outraged. Others hesitated. Jaden's chest tightened. Did they believe him? Dalton's turn, a performance of lies. Then it was Dalton's turn. He walked to the stand like he belonged there, like this whole thing was just a waste of his time. His lawyer paced in front of him, a small smile on his lips. "Officer Dalton," the man said smoothly, "you've heard the accusations against you. What do you say to them?" Dalton sighed. "I say it's all been blown out of proportion." He shrugged, as if this was all ridiculous. "I was just trying to maintain order," Dalton continued. "I asked the boy to stand. I wanted to see if he actually needed those crutches, or if he was playing the system." He turned toward the jury. "I mean, what kind of cop would I be if I let people lie to me?" Jaden felt sick. He wanted to scream. Dalton wasn't just lying. He was performing. And worse, some of the jury was buying it. The final blow. Jaden's father stood, calm, controlled. And then he played the full video. The video where Dalton wasn't just asking questions. The video where Dalton was mocking Jaden, where he was laughing as Jaden fell, where he had thrown the crutches away and taunted him in front of the crowd. The courtroom fell deathly silent. One juror closed their eyes. Another pressed a hand to their temple. Dalton's face drained of color. It was over. Jaden exhaled. He had won. The truth that couldn't be ignored. The video played on a large courtroom screen, its grainy quality doing nothing to soften the impact of what was being shown. It wasn't just evidence, it was irrefutable proof. Dalton's voice, clear and dripping with contempt, echoed through the silent courtroom. "People like you always look for something to lean on. What if you just got up and did something useful? Come on, boy. Show everyone what you can do." And then, the moment that had been seared into Jaden's memory forever. The moment Dalton kicked his crutches away. The courtroom was frozen. Some jurors winced as they watched Jaden fall, their discomfort impossible to hide. Others shifted in their seats, their expressions grim. One woman, a teacher in her 50s, pressed a hand to her mouth, her eyes brimming with emotion. Dalton sat rigid, his jaw clenched, his fingers twitching against the table. He wasn't grinning anymore. His defense attorney let out a slow breath, shoulders sinking ever so slightly. He knew. They had lost. The judge speaks. Judge Everett, a broad-shouldered man with years of legal experience behind him, leaned forward. His face was unreadable, but his voice was unforgiving. Officer Dalton. His words cut through the silence like a blade. Dalton swallowed. The judge turned toward the jury. Do you need to review the footage again before deliberation? The jury foreman, a man in his 60s with tired eyes, shook his head. No, Your Honor. His voice was firm. We've seen enough. Dalton's lawyer stood, attempting to salvage what little dignity remained. Your Honor, I'd like to remind the court that context matters. The video only shows a portion of what happened that day. My client was attempting to assess whether or not. Judge Everett cut him off with a raised hand. We're not debating what we just saw, he said, voice steady but sharp. Your client was given a chance to explain himself. He told his version of events. And now we have video footage proving he was lying. Dalton's attorney opened his mouth again, but then closed it. Because what could he say? How could he spin this? Dalton, for the first time since the trial began, looked nervous. Jaden speaks one last time. The prosecutor turned to Jaden. Would you like to say anything else before we conclude? She asked. Jaden hesitated. His mother, still seated behind him, gave him an encouraging nod. His father didn't speak. He didn't need to. Jaden knew exactly what he was thinking. Stand your ground, son. You belong here. Jaden turned back to the microphone. His throat felt tight, but he pushed forward. I just want to say that I didn't ask for this. He exhaled. I didn't want to be the center of some big case. I didn't want to be on the news. I didn't want people sending me hate messages or calling me names online. I just wanted to be a kid. The jury watched him closely. Even the courtroom spectators, many of whom had seen dozens of trials, were hanging on to his words. I didn't do anything wrong that day, Jaden continued. I was just there, laughing, existing. And he turned slightly, eyes locking on Dalton. Made me feel like that was a crime. Dalton's expression didn't change, but his posture did. For the first time, Jaden saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Not arrogance, not mocking amusement, but uncertainty. Jaden didn't look away. I'm not the only kid this has happened to, he said. I'm just lucky enough that it got caught on camera. His voice was steady now. I want justice, not just for me, but for every kid who's been told they don't belong, who's been made to feel small, who's been laughed at while they were in pain. His hands gripped the armrests of his chair. I want this to mean something. And then he was done. A long silence followed. No one spoke, not even Dalton. Because what could he say? The verdict. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. That, in itself, spoke volumes. When they returned, the foreman stood, looking directly at Dalton. The tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. The judge asked, Has the jury reached a verdict? The foreman nodded. We have, Your Honor. He took a breath. Then, in the case of assault against a minor, we find the defendant guilty. A ripple of emotion moved through the courtroom. Dalton flinched. The foreman continued. In the case of misuse of authority, guilty. Jaden's mother let out a breath she had been holding for weeks. In the case of reckless endangerment, guilty. Dalton exhaled sharply, his lips pressing into a thin line. The final charge came. In the case of official misconduct, guilty. It was over. Dalton, who had spent his entire career walking into this very courtroom with power, was now standing there as a convicted man. and the entire world had seen it happen. The aftermath. The judge ordered Dalton's immediate firing from the police force. His sentencing was set for a later date. He would never wear a badge again. Jaden should have felt relieved. And in a way, he did. But as he sat there, staring at Dalton's back as he was led away, he realized something. This wasn't the end. Dalton was just one man. The system that created him, that allowed him to get away with this for so long, that was still standing. And if this fight was going to mean anything, it couldn't stop here. So as he walked out of the courtroom, his father beside him, reporters shouting questions, Jaden didn't answer. Not yet, because he had something bigger to say, and he was going to make sure the whole world heard it. A legacy born from fire. The noise after the storm. Jaden Carter had spent months being at the center of something much bigger than himself. And now, as he stood outside the courthouse, the noise of the world rushing in, he finally understood. This wasn't about one bad cop. This wasn't about a single act of cruelty. It was about a system. One that had allowed this to happen. One that had protected men like Dalton for too long. And even though Dalton was now a convicted man, even though Jaden had won in court, the war wasn't over. The battle had just changed form. Jaden's father, Christopher Carter, had his hand on his shoulder, his grip firm. The courthouse steps were swarming with reporters, their cameras flashing, their microphones shoved forward, their voices overlapping. Jaden, how do you feel about the guilty verdict? Do you think this sets a precedent for future cases of police brutality? Do you have a message for Officer Dalton? Jaden exhaled, gripping his crutches tightly. He was exhausted, but something inside him had shifted. He had been forced into this fight. Now he was choosing to stay in it, and he was not backing down. The statement heard around the world. The cameras zoomed in as Jaden took one step forward. The crowd hushed. He wasn't the scared kid who had fallen to the ground that day at the barbecue anymore. He wasn't the victim. He was the voice, a voice that could no longer be silenced. He looked directly into the cameras, his voice steady. Justice, he said, isn't just about one guilty verdict. The crowd leaned in, their anticipation thick in the air. It's about making sure that no one else ever has to go through what I went through. What so many others have gone through. He gripped his crutches harder. This case was never just about me, he continued. It was about the people who never got their justice, the people whose stories were ignored, the kids who never got to stand up for themselves. Jaden paused, letting his words sink in. And then, we're done being ignored. A roar of applause erupted from the crowd. The movement had just shifted. This was no longer about Jaden Carter versus Raymond Dalton. This was about accountability on a national scale. Jaden wasn't just a kid who had been wronged. He had become a leader. Dalton faces the consequences. Weeks later, Raymond Dalton stood in an orange jumpsuit, shackled at the wrists. His sentencing hearing was packed. Gone was the arrogant smirk. Gone was the swagger. Instead, he looked smaller, like a man who had finally realized that he wasn't untouchable. The judge didn't spare him mercy. Officer Dalton, Judge Everett's voice was stern. You abused your power in a way that was not only unlawful but morally reprehensible. Dalton stared at the table, refusing to look at the jury, at Jaden, at the families who had shown up to see this moment of accountability. For your crimes, the judge continued, this court sentences you to 10 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole for the first 6. The room was silent. Then, a ripple of reactions. Dalton's face fell. His lawyer's shoulders tensed. And Jaden just watched. He had felt anger. He had felt humiliation. But now, he just felt tired. This wasn't victory. It was just the bare minimum of justice. And justice wasn't enough. A future Jaden never expected. The trial had ended. The sentencing was final. But the world was still watching Jaden Carter. He had become something bigger than he ever imagined. His social media was flooded, not just with messages of support, but with stories. Other kids, other families, people who had been through the same thing, who never got their justice, who never had their voices heard. One day, a letter arrived at his doorstep. It was from the National Youth Justice Initiative, an organization that fought for police reform and justice for victims of brutality. They wanted Jaden to join them, not just as a survivor, but as a leader. Jaden sat with the letter for a long time. He thought about everything that had happened. The pain, the fear, the moment he collapsed on the ground as the world laughed at him. The moment his father stood in front of him, unshaken. The moment he realized his voice mattered. Jaden folded the letter, looking up at his parents. He took a breath. I think I'm ready to do more. His father nodded, a quiet pride in his eyes. His mother smiled through tears. And for the first time in months, Jaden felt at peace. Because he wasn't just moving on. He was moving forward. 1 year later, a year after the trial, Jaden Carter stood in front of thousands. Not in a courtroom, not in a barbecue park, but at a national rally for police accountability. He was no longer a kid with crutches. He was a movement. He was the boy who stood back up. He took the mic, looking out at the sea of faces, the signs that read, "Justice for all." No Maori silence, and one that made his chest tighten. "Stand your ground, Jaden." He smiled. And then he spoke. Not as a victim, not as a survivor, but as a leader who would never let anyone take his voice away again.